Welcome back. Thanks so much for staying with us here on the AM Report. Now, nearly 120 South African delegates who were meant to travel to Russia and Ukraine to join President Cyril Ramaphosa at the Africa Peace Mission are back home after being stuck in Poland. The group consisted of journalists, police and the SANDF. Now, Polish officials reportedly accused the South African Presidential Protection Services and police of not having permits for bringing their weapons into the country. Let's unpack the story further. We're joined this morning by Aviation and Defence journalist Dean Wingrin. He joins us via our video link. Dean, it's great to see you. Thanks very much for coming on to the program. There are so many questions outstanding insofar as the story is concerned, right? But perhaps let's begin here on the issue of permits. Do you reckon that Polish authorities were being difficult, as is the account of Wally Rueda, the head of the President's Protection Unit? He said that they insisted, for example, on having originals of the documentation that they're meant to have with them. And that's never happened to them before. What do you make of that, Dean?
Good morning, and thank you for having me. I can well understand the frustrations of the general, but I think it's pretty internationally recognized that whenever anybody travels, you take original documentation with me. Much like any tourist travels to another country, always has his original passport. If he has a visa, you take that documentation with. And so it's something as important as when you're taking weapons and security people into a foreign country, you make sure that your documentation is up to par. It's not the first time that South Africa does this. In fact, the President himself has traveled to Europe, to Poland, and then into Ukraine with a very small team of his close personal protection members. And from what I understand, they had no issues carrying their personal firearms into these countries. It's all about how you go about obtaining the clearances and the documentation you take with you.
Of course, these things never happen in isolation. There's been some sort of commiseration around whether relations between South Africa and Poland are already strained, given the discussions around Janusz Waluś, for example, and his repatriation. Do you think, on the balance of probabilities, on the facts before us, that could have influenced how the South African delegation were treated?
There's very definitely a backstory to this. And as you say, there is history between Poland and South Africa with Waluś, who has been denied parole for quite some time, and I believe Poland is eager to get him back to Poland and possibly serve out any term that he has left with his family there. But that's not only any sort of history between the two countries, in the sense that South Africa is an arms exporting country, but all arms that are exported has to be approved by the National Conventional Arms Control Committee. And Poland has purchased arms from South Africa, but they're currently denied export permits to obtain those weapons because South Africa currently has a policy of not supplying weapons to countries that are in active conflict. And thus you'll find that South Africa will not export arms to Ukraine. The official policy is that they will not export arms to Russia. But they're also denying Poland arms because they fear that these arms will then be transferred to Ukraine. So there is tension there already. And then you have a civilian aircraft arriving in Poland with a large amount of weapons and arms on board, commensurate with a certain threat level that South Africa perceives to be in Ukraine. I don't believe these weapons were going to be smuggled to Russia or anything like that. But, of course, the Polish are then going to make certain that everything is in order And South Africa should be well aware of this. There should be institutional memory that when President Putin came to South Africa about 6 or 8 years ago, at the convention center in Durban, President Putin's personal bodyguards wanted to bring weapons into the meeting room. And South African, in fact, the Presidential Protection Service denied President Putin's personal bodyguards from bringing weapons into the meeting area. And going back even further, about 20 years ago, when Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, leader of Libya, came to South Africa once again denied him entry, bringing in a lot of weapons and armored vehicles and so on. So this is a known thing throughout the diplomatic world, that when you're going to go into a foreign country and you're bringing in weapons and security personnel, it's discussed with those countries in detail, and everything is noted beforehand, and you bring the correct documentation that with you, and any what's stipulated in the documentation is then allowed in.
Yeah, especially if those weapons, as you say, are weapons that are used in conflict and are not the typical weapons that you would take along for presidential protection.
Well, we don't know exactly what was taken, but I do believe a risk analysis was performed before the president was scheduled to go to Ukraine. This normally involves senior members of the security detail going to the country of destination, doing the risk assessment, and then seeing what needs to be taken with. And this isn't just sort of restricted to handguns and maybe a rifle or two. Depending on the risk, you will take sniper rifles, because you will need to be placed on high-rise buildings or in an area where you can survey the surrounding area and see if there are counter snipers, or you act as a counter sniper to see if there's any other snipers in the area that would be a risk to your principal. And allied with that, there might be electronic warfare equipment, cell jamming or something like that, vehicles as well. But in this case, it might be a little bit of overreach, because Ukraine is very well versed in hosting senior diplomats and leaders of the world. I mean, even the US president has been there. And so Ukraine is a war zone, but it's not a war zone in that there's people running around shooting each other in Kyiv itself. You're certainly at risk of missiles and so on. But you can rely on the Ukrainian security services as well to provide the bulk of that security. And then the visiting country can then just provide the more close-in personal protection.
Right,
with
right.
the assistance
That's a good segue into my next question around security numbers, Dean. A lot has been said about the kinds of numbers that presidents ordinarily bring on trips of this nature, and the president having had in excess of 120 security personnel on that trip with him. Outside of the fact that is a logistical nightmare, just in terms of travel, in terms of hotel stay, the papers that are needed. Is it excessive insofar as security personnel for a president on a trip of this nature?
Well, yes, that goes back to the risk assessment. So if you're going into a country, like President Thabo Mbeki went into, I think, Sierra Leone all those years ago, which was an active war zone, you cannot rely on the local security apparatus to provide the bulk of the protection. Then you take your own large security detail. If you're going to a first world country with their own sort of high standard of security, and protection, then you take a far smaller security detail. In this case, as I said, out of all the African leaders and senior diplomats that went on this trip, South Africa certainly had the largest security detail, certainly at least 3 times as large as the next largest detail. Most of the countries that accompanied President Ramaphosa, they had a handful and maybe a few extra toes of people there to provide security. Certainly not in the numbers and equipped as the South Africans did. And I think it's also important to go back to a previous point I said, whereas the President's VVIP travel, that is normally done by the Air Force. The South African Air Force has a special unit who's dedicated to providing VVIP transport and arranging that transport, which includes liaising with the host countries via DIRCO and obtaining clearances both for security as well as for any accompanying security, and as well as the trip that the aircraft is going to take. And in this instance, I believe it was SAPS, the police, who chartered a civilian aircraft. And so when the President flies, he flies on an Air Force call sign. This aircraft was a civilian aircraft flown on a civilian call sign, arriving in a foreign country, or carrying weapons and security people. So, of course, I think Poland, given the tensions between the country, will act strictly according to how they can act, and will give no leeway for slight errors in documentation and so on.
Yeah, which is exactly what the Polish government have said, while the South African government here at home still no official word on the trip itself. Dean, let me thank you for your time this morning. Dean Wingrin is an aviation and defence journalist. As we continue to unpack the story, several legs to it. The EFF, for example, is now demanding that the South African government downgrade the Polish embassy here in South Africa and expel the ambassador. It's part of our Twitter poll question to you as well this morning.